have moved. Sorry, I should have thought about the recording. That's the thing you always forget. But thanks again for joining us. We have shifted from a monthly meeting format to a quarterly meeting. If you haven't been able to join us for a while, I know some folks still might have a meeting invite, a monthly meeting invite on their calendar. Maybe it was forwarded on or some way it got on their calendar. We will be sending out new invitations for these quarterly meetings. So please feel free to remove those from your calendar. We don't want anyone joining those meetings when they're not happening. We don't want to waste any of your time. So thanks again, and we'll go ahead and get started. Today, we are diving deep into credentials of value. So if we go to the next slide, I think that's our agenda slide. And like I mentioned, Jared and I are in Arkansas with our partners here. So it's been a little bit crazy, so bear with me. But here is a glimpse at our agenda of what we're going to be going through today. We're very excited for this presentation to hear from our presenters, Lindsay and Steve, who will introduce themselves here in a moment. But we will be diving deep into that credentials of value topic, hoping to hear from you. We'll have some questions that we'll pose for you, and we really welcome the conversation. So if you want to put questions, comments in the chat, or you want to come off mute, we really would love to hear from you. We want it to be a very engaging conversation today. We also have some Credential Engine updates that we'll share with you at the end of this presentation. And this is being recorded, so we can send this out if you'd like to share this with others after the meeting. And then we'll just do a quick wrap up. So I am going to go ahead and ask for a transition to the next slide. And I think that I am tossing this over to Jared.
Thanks, Jillian. Hi, everyone. We know that there are a number of folks on the webinar today who may not be particularly familiar with Credential Engine and our work. So as we kind of kick this off, we just wanted to provide a very quick overview so we can kind of orient everyone in the discussion. Credential Engine, we are a nonprofit whose mission is to map the credential landscape. And we do this by building the infrastructure that makes data about credentials public, accessible, and actionable. We want to make it as easy for someone to navigate through all of their educational opportunities as it is to pick up a smartphone to find your next vacation on Expedia and Travelocity. Next slide, please. So one of the keys to doing this is the Credential Transparency Description Language, the CTDL is the acronym that we use. CTDL is a common language for describing the learn and work ecosystem. It has over 1,100 terms, so the CTDL can describe rich and detailed information about credentials, skills, cost, value, education and employment outcomes, and much more. So with this richness of the CTDL in mind, we really see Credential Engine's role in this discussion as helping describe credentials of value rather than defining them ourselves. So however you or your partners or your stakeholders describe credentials of value, we want to provide the descriptive language and the tools to help you communicate this information in whatever level of detail or context is most appropriate. So that's kind of our background and where we see our fit in this conversation today. Jillian, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. That was a great overview of Credential Engine. And if we go to the next slide, we are going to be diving more into our credentials of value conversation and how the registry can assist with these efforts, and also hearing from our experts that have so graciously joined us for this conversation. But before we dive deep in, we wanted to go to the next slide, and I had hoped to have a Zoom poll, but I am still figuring out, oh, it is working. Okay, wonderful. So I thought you were going to have to put this in the chat, but if you have any context or any information you'd like to plug into the chat outside of just answering this poll, please do. So the poll should have popped up for you, and we would like to know if your agency or state is considering or implementing a credentials of value definition. So please feel free to answer, and then we'll take a look at the results. And I will say, I'm not entirely sure. Was it Chantel? Did you do the poll? Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll give it.
So whenever
Yes.
you're ready to pop, I think those results should pop up on here too, right?
They should. Okay, we've been at a minute now, so.
And if they don't, that's okay. That's information that we can also share with you later in our follow-up.
So 50% of participants said yes, their state or agency is considering or has implemented a definition. 6% said no, and then 44% were unsure. So kind of a mix.
Wonderful. Thank you for reading out those numbers. Okay, well, let's go ahead and dive in. So if we go to the next slide, I wanted to let Lindsay introduce herself. So I'm going to toss it over to Lindsay.
Great. Thanks, Jillian, and hi, everyone. It's great to be with you this afternoon. I'm Lindsay Reitzman-Cruz. I'm a senior fellow with the National Skills Coalition, which, if you don't know us, is a national nonprofit whose mission is to fight for a national commitment to inclusive and high-quality skills training. So should we just go on to my slide? Great. So if you, today I was asked to talk a little bit about how states are developing ways to identify quality non-degree credentials. We all know that industry practices and technology are rapidly changing, and so are the jobs and skills they require. More adults are looking to quickly learn new skills or upgrade their existing skills so they can adapt to these changes and advance in their careers. And non-degree credentials, especially quality non-degree credentials and their related programs, offer a way to do that, particularly when people are balancing upskilling with a job and a family. In addition to being occupation specific, they also tend to be more affordable and take less time to complete than a degree. And we're also seeing states really investing in and building infrastructure around non-degree credentials, including investments in state financial aid and other funding to support the provision of non-degree connected learning. And these investments are often viewed by states as a key strategy for addressing workforce gaps, while also ensuring more equitable access to programs that don't often qualify for federal financial aid or traditional state aid programs. Next slide. So just to make sure we're all speaking the same language, non-degree credentials to us are any post-secondary credential beyond a high school diploma or its equivalent that is below an associate's degree. They're conferred after a completion of a credit-bearing or a non-credit academic or training course or evaluation of skills. They include certificates, industry certifications, apprenticeship certificates, occupational licenses, badges, micro-credentials, and probably more that are on this list. And to us, a quality non-degree credential is one that provides people with the means to equitably achieve their employment and education goals. And we'll talk a little bit about how National Skills Coalition thinks about the evidence and the measurement that goes behind determining quality. Next slide. So just to give a little background on how we enter this conversation as an organization, over the past 4 or 5 years, NSC's worked with around 13 states to understand what it takes for states to effectively support access to and completion of quality non-degree credentials. And this has included 3 technical assistance academies with states focused on helping them to adopt a quality definition and a related quality assurance process, implement quality assurance in the context of policies to support quality non-degree credential attainment, including through expanding financial aid, and improving states' capacity to measure and report on credential quality and student outcomes connected to those credentials, and to make that information both available to the stakeholders who need it and to use it to make data-informed policy decisions. Next slide. So what you see here are a set of quality criteria that we developed in partnership with a set of states that were thinking about quality at the time. This was around 2019. That we sort of use as our standard go-to criteria for what quality means. So these criteria include evidence of substantial job opportunities, validation by employers that the credential is valued and in demand, evidence of the competencies and skills mastered by people who earn that credential, transparent evidence of the employment and earning outcomes of people with that credential, and assurance that the credential is stackable to additional educational opportunities and also portable to other regions and states. These criteria are really intended to ensure that for students and workers, non-degree credentials lead to job opportunities with better pay, and that their time and money they invest in training can count towards future educational opportunities and really help advance their careers. For businesses, they help ensure credentials are validated by industry leaders and serve as trusted indicators of workers' skills and competencies. And for policymakers, they identify the credentials in which the state should be investing to achieve their key education and workforce goals. Next slide. So through our work with states, we've published a number of reports connected to this topic. We've kind of narrowed down the steps that we see really integral for states to develop definitions of quality and advance policies aimed at those quality non-degree credentials. So these include starting with the basics, developing that quality or credentials of value definition, depending on what terminology you prefer, both for the non-degree credentials and the related programs that lead to them, and also establishing those metrics for measurement, either for statewide use or according to a particular use case. States have to develop the data-informed standards and mechanisms for assessing these credentials and their quality. And this includes gathering a foundation of data on non-degree credentials that can be used to make assessments of quality on an ongoing basis, which is something that states are really working towards, but is sort of an uphill battle. We also recommend that states seek broad and diverse input into the definitions, frameworks, and data access needs connected to non-degree credentials to make sure that the range of perspectives of key stakeholders, including state agency leaders and staff, education and workforce providers, business and industry, students and workers, are really taken into account in their development. And also this builds buy-in for that definition and for really implementing the quality assurance framework the way it's intended. And then finally, states need to determine levers to institutionalize this and make it common practice, ideally in a way that is sustained across administrations. So this can be through legislation, executive order, adoption by a board of regents, or something else. But they also have to think about how they communicate these quality standards and frameworks to key stakeholders, again, making sure that education and workforce providers, employers, students, workers, have the information they need to make good decisions. So consumer-facing tools or dashboards, and of course, your state's credential registry are great ways to do this. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about how to get that information out in a second. Next slide. So I just wanted to provide a couple of examples of states that we know of that have developed and released quality frameworks in the recent months and years. So I'll start with Colorado. They recently released a quality and in-demand non-degree credential evaluation framework, which aims to help state leaders and staff, education and workforce providers, and others clarify and incentivize key elements of quality. It includes a rubric to screen quality for credentials according to specific use cases and integrates considerations of local and regional demand and elements of value. Right now, it's qualitative in nature, but we know the state eventually intends to use data to produce disaggregated outcomes to inform quality assessments. In North Carolina, their Workforce Credentials Advisory Council has been assigning value to credentials according to those that bring value to employers, but that also help put people on a path to a living wage and advance their careers. So credentials on the list that they've created are categorized as one of 4 classifications: essential, career, foundation, or advanced. And so far, they classified over 150 credentials issued by 86 credential issuers, which of course may or may not be that community college or education provider. And right now, they're working to gather data connected to the list to kind of formalize how they're able to make these assessments. They're working in a pilot with 4 in-state credential issuers to develop a license and credentials data warehouse with the idea that eventually it can house data from all identified issuers in the state and again, inform that quality assurance process. And then finally in Tennessee, actually last month, they passed a bill which codifies their definition of quality for all types of credentials, and it's been transmitted to the governor for signing. The definition that they codified is the result of a cross-state collaborative task force, including multiple state agency representatives, college and university leaders, the Chamber of Commerce, and others. And it was also informed by their participation in the NSC Quality Credential Policy Academy. And the idea is that this definition will provide greater standardization for the administration of some key programs in the state, including Tennessee Promise. And the legislation actually extends eligibility to people pursuing quality non-degree credentials at Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technology. So exciting to see that expansion. And that's it for me. The next slide is just a thank you with my contact information if y'all have questions, but I guess I'll give it back to Jillian, or maybe I'm passing it to Steve.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lindsay. That was great information, and we'll be sure to send out the links that you've included in here and the follow-up after this in case anyone would like to dive deeper into those. So we really appreciate it. All right, I think if we go to our next slide, we are going to hear from a state perspective on this issue. So I'm going to go ahead and just toss it over to Steve to introduce himself.
Great, thanks. And hi, everybody. My name's Steve Rogness. I'm a senior research analyst at the Minnesota Office of Higher Education, where I manage our student level enrollment and awards conferred data collections, and then also our agency's coordinator with our state longitudinal data system, SLEDS, where we bring together data on K-12, college, and employment all in one place. As part of all that work, I've been part of our work on defining more credential quality and value criteria. And so I'm here to talk about the work that we've been doing in our Minnesota Quality Credentials of Value work group that's been part of our P20 education partnership, and the work that we've been doing to assemble both to establish the criteria, but then also and propose those criteria in a framework that we've proposed. So I'm going to be walking through that, and then also talk some about the work we're doing to assemble the data that we need to be able to assess those criteria, and how we can include that. And it's interesting to be thinking about how we could be including that data in Credential Engine. So you can go to the next slide. Actually, this is just a bonus title slide. We can keep going. Thank you. So yeah, so first, some background on the Minnesota Credentials of Value work group. This is a work group of our P20 education partnership. It was jointly led by the Minnesota Office of Higher Education, our workforce agency, Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, or DEED, and Minnesota State Colleges and Universities, and included a number of other stakeholders, industry representatives, folks from institutions, and other stakeholders. Where the task was we developed a proposed framework that would include both degree and non-degree credentials. We wanted to take an expansive view of the full credential landscape in Minnesota and have a proposed framework that would be flexible enough to apply across the entire spectrum, providing meaningful standards while having that flexibility to be able to look at a range of programs, from work-based training to degrees, with the goal of having standards to support consumers having better information about credentials and programs, and also to support decision-making and responsible use of public dollars. So I've got the link there, and that's something that can get sent out to a full report that we released or published about a year ago now, that includes the proposed framework that I'm going to go through. You can go to the next slide. In considering all the criteria, so the work group, we participated in the National Skills Coalition Policy Academy on the topic, and we took the National Skills Coalition areas of credential quality, and we spent a lot of time thinking too about how these different areas of criteria can be assessed differently, whether you're looking at the level of a credential, a program, or a provider. And so we organized our criteria across all three of those areas and thought about how we would be looking at those in each of the categories of assessing job opportunities, so demand, wage outcomes, knowledges and competencies, access, and then some other aspects like stackability that are encouraged. And we want to think about, okay, so when you're looking at that at the level of a credential, meaning, that indicates a predetermined set of learning outcomes, that's something where you could be looking statewide or regionally at the credentials that are in demand in that region or statewide, in job posting data, for example. when you're looking at a program, how a credential is delivered. Now we're looking at, a particular program at an institution or a training provider. And so we might be looking at actual outcomes for individuals that attended that institution or completed that program. And then also aspects of the provider, the institution, or the training provider itself that come into play. And, we were thinking about this because a lot of the credentials of value work, and then a lot of the data that we'd be, looking to include on credentials, that's all at the credential level. But then when we get into thinking about, okay, but if this was something that we could use to expand state financial aid, for example, to quality non-degree credentials, we'd be looking at aspects of programs and providers as well. And so we wanted to account for that in this framework. You can go to the next slide. So I've got our full proposed framework here. I won't go through this in all the detail, but it's broken out onto 2 slides. This is a 1-page grid in the report, but to fit it on the slides, we've got it on the next 2. So the demand and wages, the way we articulated the demand and wages criteria here for both credentials and programs are listed here. And so, and again, this is with the intent of being flexible to apply across the full credential landscape. So I think that's where you'll see some of the flexibility coming in, for example, when we look at the demand criteria as we articulated for credentials, where we were looking at alignment to occupations that are in demand statewide or regionally, or representing the completion of a program that prepares individuals for a range of employment opportunities. And also that if it's a credential that could be associated with strong self-employment outcomes, although of course that could be something that might be hard to gather more data on, especially in centralized data sources. And wages aligned to occupations that provide a family-sustaining wage, either regionally or statewide, opportunity for economic mobility, or meet essential community needs. So again, a fairly broad, flexible criteria that could be applied. In looking at a program here, we were thinking we're looking for evidence that individuals completing the program find employment at high rates in a field or profession that utilizes the skills, and on wages, evidence that individuals completing the program achieve a family-sustaining wage. So just a different way of articulating the criteria for looking at a program versus a credential. Next slide. And here we've got how we've articulated the criteria across the categories of knowledge and competencies. We also looked at access, so making sure that credentials, programs, and providers are providing access to all learners. In the case of a credential, for example, it came out in the work group that there are some external examinations and assessments where we want to look closer at the ability of folks to access that. For example, assessments and examinations that are make sure that they're not limited to, or sorry, that ones that are excluding English language learners, for example, was an issue that was brought up, and so we wanted to look at the assessment and examination aspect of that. And then also encouraging stackability so that the credential is stackable to additional training or upward career mobility. On the program side, this is where looking for learning outcomes to be published and meet the skills and knowledge needed in the aligned and demand occupations, and other criteria for the programs, including a strategy for assessing learning. Instructors are knowledgeable in the program of study. Programs prioritize culturally inclusive practices. And on the provider side, then we were looking at the baseline consumer protections that are in place in terms of making sure that providers are approved by OHE, accredited or otherwise vetted by an agency, board, or designated authority, and that they are providing access and inclusion for all students, and having wraparound supports. The wraparound supports piece was something that really came up as we were discussing non-credit programs in particular, where a lot of times those at institutions can be don't come with the same amount of supports that are provided on the credit side. So that was something that really came up in our conversations. Next slide. So in thinking about what data we're working to assemble, when we're looking at, so what do we know about outcomes? when we're looking at employment and wage outcomes, we already publish pretty robust data for outcomes of graduates of degree and certificate programs, so credit-based, at all public and nearly all private colleges in Minnesota. So in our longitudinal data system, we tie the data that OHE collects on awards conferred, and we tie that to the state's unemployment insurance database from DEED and publish those outcomes in a tool housed at DEED. And I've got the link here for that. So we know a lot about employment rates, industry of employment, median wages for credit-based programs and credentials. We've also expanded our data collection to include non-credit programs that are listed on the state's eligible training provider list. So the data that OHE gathers now includes any program listed on the state's eligible training provider list, whether credit or non-credit. So that's a partnership that we began between our agency and DEED in 2021. So that data collection could facilitate the expansion into non-credit programs of looking at these wage outcomes. Right now, it's so far only used for WIOA reporting, but that could be something that we could expand in the future. And then next steps that we're taking on this, we really want to look at that job posting data piece. And this could fill an important gap in understanding of industry recognized credentials, so certifications and licenses, and what do we know about the alignment of those credentials, how they appear in qualifications and job postings, and the alignment to occupations that meet demand and wage thresholds. So we've seen examples from other states where more of that information is published. We're pursuing doing the same thing in Minnesota. And then also looking to collect more data from institutions and training providers through OHE's licensing and registration process to inform these criteria. We can go to the next slide. In terms of Minnesota and Credential Engine, the credential information that we've added to date, I believe, includes credentials from Minnesota State colleges and universities, one of our 2 public systems, as well as credentials that are listed on the state's eligible training provider list. And OHE plans to add additional credential data after finishing upgrades to our institutional licensing and registration database. And it's helpful to be learning more about how the information, and the indicators of quality and value that we're looking to assess and include and gather more data on can be included in Credential Engine, and how other states are doing that. So, and I meant to kind of say up front, so I'm here to kind of provide an example of a state, we're kind of on the journey here on this topic, not here to say we've got it all figured out, but sort of here's kind of where we're at and what we're thinking about. So looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Steve. It was great to get that state perspective. And I saw Rachel nodding her head at quite a bit of it since she comes from Minnesota. Just one quick thing before I turn it over to Rachel for the Credential Engine piece of all of this. I've seen a couple questions come in the chat. Please feel free to put more in there, and then we'll answer those during the discussion that we have here in just a bit. So Rachel, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Jillian. And thank you, Lindsay and Steve, for providing a really excellent overview of some of the common definitions of credential of value frameworks that states are implementing. And obviously, in the case of Minnesota, some more of the specifics. Tip of the hat to all of the Minnesota folks on the call as well. I saw Jess and Sherry and Veronica in our participant list. What I want to be able to do in the next few minutes is just talk a little bit about how we at Credential Engine can really help support your definitions and work around quality credentials. The Credential Transparency Description Language, or CTDL, that Jared referenced earlier, and the Credential Registry itself doesn't independently determine quality. We want information on all credentials so that students and learners have full information about their education and employment pathways. So for us at Credential Engine, we, through the CTDL and the registry, want to help you describe your definitions of quality and make that information available as linked open data. So the next few slides are just some illustrations about how making information about quality, whether it's wage outcomes, whether it's the support services offered, whether it's the skills or competencies that a learner earns, how you leverage our tools and technologies to make this information more transparent and available for students and learners. So on the next slide, you'll see just one example. And actually, this was one that didn't come up as clearly in our discussion today, but has with other states, which is the registry can help to connect a given organization or a given credential to information on who accredits, approves, recognizes, or regulates that training provider or that credential. So our partners from the Kansas Board of Regents who are on the call have done a great job of publishing a lot of information on all of the credentials and organizations where they perform a quality assurance action. As well as at the credential level, you're able to see, for instance, who actually approves that particular certificate at a community college. This example is in Iowa. If you go on to the next slide, and I took a page from Minnesota's definition in Steve's presentation, I want to also be able to show you that the CTDL and the registry can support the support services that an institution offers. This kind of view just shows you for one particular state who is publishing its list of eligible training providers. They are actually collecting information from their ETPL process to be able to publish support service definitions. If you go on to the next slide, we also support all types of outcomes reporting. I'm not seeing that next slide come up. We might have to click again, Cadence. There we go. We support all kinds of outcomes reporting. So whether that is Indiana, who is publishing really return on investment outcomes 1, 2, 3, 5 years after graduation, or states like in Illinois who are publishing WIOA related outcomes for training programs on their eligible training provider list, the CTDL can support all of that. Cadence, if you click to the next slide, there you get a snapshot of the Illinois example. Those familiar with WIOA performance reporting outcomes might recognize some of those terms. And if you go to the next slide, just really important for us to recognize that there are ways that your states might define outcomes. There are ways that you might be indicating whether or not a credential meets a livable wage or meets a wage threshold to be on a credential of value list. What I want you all to just take away from this is that the CTDL can fully support your definitions of outcomes. And in the case of our work with Pennsylvania, we have been able to take information that exists on a workforce outcomes dashboard and to make that outcomes data available in the registry as linked open data. And a couple more slides for me. Another big topic that we heard a lot about was skills and competencies. And in the registry, you can publish information on the skills or competencies that are associated with a credential. So here is an example of a training that is available on Colorado's list of eligible training providers as a part of their data collection on the ETPL. Cadence, if you click one more time, you will see that they actually ask training providers to provide information about what skills a student or learner will earn as a part of that training program, and all of that information is available on the registry. You are also able to tap into the competencies and skills that credentials provide to students and learners if that credential is offered by a third party, a national, global credential provider. On the next slide, I think you should see an example of Microsoft, who is now publishing competency information for the credentials that they issue if you click one more time, Cadence, you'll see just an example of what those competencies look like in the registry. And the final thing that I also want to make reference to, since this was brought up and the term stackability was used in the credential registry, we can also provide a lot of information on how a given learning or a credential transfers to another institution, another pathway, whether it's through publishing complete lists of transfer values like the Kansas Board of Regents has done, or whether it's an institution like Bismarck State College who accepts an industry recognized credential for credit. And just a note here that we have been working with ACE to publish their national guide or recommendations of equivalent post-secondary academic credit for prior learning. There are over 10,000 learning opportunities and associated credit recommendations that now exist in the registry for you to tap into. And I think I have one more slide to go, and this will help us jump into what I know is the conversation upcoming, which is how else can you contextualize a list of credentials of value in the registry? And one fantastic tool we have is what we call a collection. This is a collection or a group of credentials or learning opportunities that meet a certain criteria that you have established. Lists of eligible training providers are a great example. So too are industry recognized or quality lists. And what we have displayed here is a list of credentials that have met a definition for the Accelerating Opportunities Kansas list, which is short-term certificate programs that are aligned to labor market needs that lead to industry recognized credentials and jobs. Sounds very similar to the types of credential of value definitions that Lindsay has presented to us. So there is a wealth of resources that we can provide. On the next slide, we've listed a couple here. We'll drop some links in the chat. We have mapped a lot of the common credential of value frameworks, including the framework that Lindsay and National Skills Coalition have presented and developed, so that all of the definitions that you are coming up with are easily connected to CTDL and can be published in the registry. And our very last slide, for those who might not be as familiar with Credential Engine and publishing to the registry, we just want to point out here that we have a wealth of tools that are available for you, and we're happy to work with you to find a publishing method that works best and to get the information you have on credentials and your definitions of qualities in the registry, so that all of this is available as linked open data for students and learners. Jillian, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. That was a great deep dive there. And as we mentioned, we'll share this information after the webinar ends so that you can go through all of these great links and dig into some more information yourself. We do have a discussion time period set aside here where we'd love to hear questions from you, and then we'll have Steve and Lindsay and the Credential Engine team available to answer any questions. I know there are a couple that have been put into the chat, so we might want to just go ahead and start there. And if you have any after this, you're more than welcome to come off mute, or if you want to continue to put them in the chat. So I guess I'll go ahead and kick off with the first one from the chat, and that was from Kelvin. It was, for wages, is there a time frame for when a learner, especially those post-graduation, would need to achieve a livable wage in order for the non-degree credential to be determined a credential of value?
I can say for Minnesota, we haven't set that, but I think it's an interesting question, and I think what I'd be looking at initially is, and what we already publish for credit-based is a lot of different time ranges, and so you can see that wage progression over time, and recognizing that you know, there may be for some credential, depending on the type of credential, those, you know, those wage impacts may be more immediate versus, you know, over a longer time to accrue. Or so, yeah, I think it's an interesting aspect of the data that we need to look at. And Lindsay, I'd be curious if you know, how you've seen time ranges in other states' criteria, if you have any other perspective on that.
I think it varies. I want to say, I don't know if anybody here is from Michigan. The Michigan Skills Scholarship has a 6-month pre and post kind of wage premium connection, not connection, for its criteria for programs that are deemed eligible to receive those funds. So that's one example. And then I was trying to remember what the federal GE requirements say. I know that those have something that's have a time bound on wage premiums, but I can't remember what that is off the top of my head. Unfortunately, I don't know if anybody else knows, but yeah, so I think it just varies. And I think, frankly, a lot of states still have pretty qualitative frameworks, like I mentioned, and are working to get those specific thresholds set. So sort of a work in progress.
Thank you both. And this is the time, if anyone else would like to come off of mute and chime in on this conversation, we'd love to have your thoughts.
This is Natalie from Pennsylvania. Lindsay, I was literally looking up the same exact thing, the financial value transparency, to see what the guidelines were around that. I just didn't dig in far enough yet. But same as Steve had said, we do produce our information at the 3, 5, and 10-year mark, but we don't distinguish like what that cutoff of a time frame to for that income of value for the credential. So, yep.
Great, thanks, Natalie. Okay, we had another question from Kelvin that I'll go ahead and pose. Does the data include I'm assuming in DC is non-degree credentials from providers like Google, Meta, and IBM? And if students complete these during their undergraduate or graduate programs, do you have a way to compare majors who earn them versus those who do not?
Getting this data on, I'm really interested in better understanding how to get, you know, data on third-party certifications, these the industry certifications. Right now, for the non-credit data that we collect, we're collecting completion reports from non-credit programs if they're listed on the ETPL. We want those to mean that the individual attained the credential. In some cases, I think the providers say, I can tell you they graduated, but I can't tell you yet if they completed the credential, right? So that difference is an important difference in the data that we're collecting. And then if there was some way to get this data at an individual level directly from the industry certifying organizations themselves, providing the certifications, that'd be really interesting. You know, when we look at, you know, how can we get better individual level data on, for example, in our SLDS on the full range of credentials. So in Minnesota, we have some licensing data, but it's, you know, it's industry certifications, licenses, and then also some, you know, non-credit certificates. Well, those would be, I think, maybe easier, but the, you know, things that aren't provided by the training provider or institution themselves directly is more of a gap, right? And so how to get more of that data. And I think yeah, being able to see the full, you know, kind of credential, you know, the credential stacking that's happening as you're noting, as students are completing these certifications throughout undergraduate or graduate programs, because that's a really important part in understanding the outcomes of industry certifications, where it's really different if the industry certification is one that basically you're only going to have that if you have a degree, versus one where at a high school level of education, you could be having that certification and having good outcomes as well. Those are really different things. And so we want to understand those patterns.
Okay, I don't know if anyone else has anything on this question. Okay, and then we had some questions that we can pose to you, but if you want to raise your hand or you just want to come off mute and pose any questions to our presenters or Credential Engine team, we are happy to address those. So I'll give you just a second here to maybe get those out to us. I see a lot coming in through the chat, so a lot of good discussion there. Okay, I am just going to take a question that we have. So anyone is welcome to chime in on this. One question we had thought of before this was, what are the challenges and or roadblocks to defining or compiling a list of credentials of value? So are there any specific issues any of you have run into in your states that you'd like to share and maybe get some perspective on?
I am speaking from Ohio. My name is Srividya Bopati. I work for the Department of Higher Education. We are very early in this process. We have an executive work order that came out from workforce order that came out from the governor's office sometime last year. And one of the big hurdles that we've been trying to navigate is there's not an easy way or definitive way to map SIP codes and SOC codes. So even if we've got a good list of in-demand jobs that we would like to tie some of our credentials of value to, not all SIP codes apply to all of the same majors, and a lot of different majors can be used in a lot of different ways. And that's one of the things that obviously you can't represent that entirely with a list of credentials of value, but we're trying to account for that kind of variability. So that's kind of the big question with our state is how do we want to begin identifying them? Do we just want to map it to our in-demand jobs list, or do we want to take it a step further and do something maybe that's a little bit more subjective by, incorporating, surveying different businesses that are in-demand industries and seeing what different credentials their employees have? And if we were to undertake something like that, what does that lift look like logistically? And what would its, statistical significance be based on response rates and things like that? So that's kind of one of the big things that we've been struggling with.
Thanks for sharing from Ohio. I know we've been working very closely with you, so happy to hear you chime in. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts that they'd like to share. Okay, and maybe you're on this call and you have some questions or some thoughts on the topic and you'd like to share with us later, you're more than welcome to do that. We've thought about sending out a short survey just to ask you some questions about what's going on in your state or your organization. So keep a lookout for that. We have time probably for maybe one or two more questions. I guess one I'll throw out here. What are any successes, wins, or areas of alignment you've been a part of when doing this work around credentials of value, or anything you foresee that would help facilitate the work?
I would just highlight, like I already talked some about the expansion of our of OHE's data collection to include all programs on our state's ETPL and including that data in our SLDS. That's been a really great partnership between OHE and DEED here. And, you know, it was a great step for OHE into more non-credit data and understanding that better. And so, and I know, I think, Lindsay, had you posted something from Rutgers in the chat, but you know, they've got a non-credit data collaborative that I've been participating in. Maybe others here have as well. And that's been a really interesting area too, to learn more about nationally, as more states are trying to get a better handle on non-credit. So that's been a productive direction for us.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, actually, Steve. That's just such a huge hole for most states in their ability to understand the programs that lead to non-reviewed credentials and student outcomes connected to them. The work that Rutgers is doing, both to understand the landscape nationally, but also with particular states like Iowa, Virginia, Louisiana, and others. It's really, I mean, it's exciting to see them start to do some, actually, there's been some rigorous evaluation research that's come out connected to like Virginia's Fast Forward State Financial Aid Program, where they can actually be able to say something about how the non-credit programs that are eligible for those funds are affecting people's economic outcomes. And they have a real focus on economic mobility in their state, and are asking some tough questions and being able to utilize that data to really answer those and inform how they move the work forward as a state, and the Virginia community college system in particular. So I know Virginia is always talked about, but for good reason, I think. So yeah, I think just shoring up that data foundation, figuring out where your gaps are, and then slowly starting to build buy-in for the investment and the resources that it takes to really build those data up so you can answer some key questions is important. And a challenge, a big challenge too.
Great. Thank you so much for that great discussion that we've just had. I know it's getting close to the top of the hour, so we do need to wrap up. I want to thank Steve and Lindsay and Rachel for presenting on this topic. If you have any questions for them, feel free to send them our way or to them, and we will get those addressed. So just a few updates before we do wrap up. I think I'm doing this update section. So here are a couple newer items that we've had over the past few months. You might have joined our webinars that we've hosted on these two topics that are listed. We have a new guidance website. The link is right there, guidance.credentialengine.org. There's a lot of wonderful resources that we're constantly adding to about publishing and consuming. So feel free to take a look at that. If there's anything on that site you think would be helpful, we're happy to add to it, but there are really built out instructions with screenshots, videos. So we're hoping that that will be a great resource for everyone. And also in the past few months, we've added some new certificate types to the CTDL. So you can see there's 22 new types. So if you go to the link that's here, that is the guidance site, but it has a listing of all of the different credential types. We also have our CredReg website that gets a little more in the weeds on the technical side. But that might be something that in your state you need to look back at the certificates. Maybe they were defined just under certificate and you want to break them out based on a certain academic certificate or apprenticeship. You can do that now with this new CTDL. If we go to the next slide, we have a quality assurance actions pilot that has kicked off. So that is diving deep with some of our partners into those actions that recognize the quality assurance processes. So that includes a credit action, approval, recognize, and regulate. So we'll have some more probably at our next meeting on that pilot. And then our last update on here is the prior learning portability pilot. So we've talked and during this conversation about the ACE credit recommendations, and we've mentioned this previously in communication. So just trying to get out there that institutions can signal acceptance of those credit recommendations for CPL. And it's a way for learners to better understand how their prior learning meets course and program requirements. If you want to find out more about any updates, or you want to check out our state partnerships page, that is linked on this slide. So feel free to take a look at that after the meeting. But we will be off here for a couple of months. And then if we go to our next slide, our next meeting will be August 14th. So we'll work on having a main discussion topic. We're throwing around some different ideas right now. If you have anything you'd like to suggest, please do. But we will get that meeting on your calendar. And as always, if you have any questions or feedback, or you'd just like to reach out to us, our contact information is info@credentialengine.org, or reach out to one of us personally and we will assist. So thank you so much. Thank you again to everyone who helped make this call possible, and we will see you next time.